It's great to have you all here today. We'll start since it is 2 and I know we're mindful of time, but again, we appreciate you joining us. My name is Shannon Spurlock. I'm the sales director at Kanopy. I've been with Kanopy over the last 6 years, and in a short period of time, we have seen such an expansive shift in demand for streaming videos at academic libraries. And I'm sure that's why many of you are here today. I see many familiar faces in the audience. Flashing back a few years ago, I remember working closely with most of you on how to actually get students and faculty using the streaming films. But now we see campuses' requests, expectations, and demand outpacing what they had thought would happen in this short period of time. Videos for curriculum, videos for research, videos for personal enrichment. But this intersection is challenging for libraries in terms of managing the demand and aligning it to their larger strategic initiatives and budgetary goals. So today, we wanted to focus on both Kerri Goergen-Doll, the Director of Collections, Acquisitions, and Resource Sharing at Oregon State, on how they're managing streaming video at their library, and also Ryan Wilkins, Kanopy's Marketing Analyst, just to give you a global view of user behavior, both in comparison to all the institutions we're working with, but how it aligns with Oregon State, and look at ways that we can work together to find the best solutions going forward. Before I pass over to Kerri, I just want to cover off a couple of things with regards to the changing landscape of video. So right now, US adults are spending 6 hours per day on video. 74% of US consumers subscribe to a commercial streaming platform. And on Kanopy, in the last 4 years, we've seen a 258% increase in demand. Now, I will say that correlates with number of new users, not just those same users watching more, but it's a significant expansion of the demand for streaming video. Now, many of us are asking why. Some of it's more straightforward than others. Faculty and students are engaged with video. We're using it every day. But it's also proven to positively impact educational outcomes, whether it's motivation, memory retention, test scores, satisfaction. But these are changes and expectations that we can have going forward. I was actually speaking with a librarian yesterday that said streaming video is the future, but we just need to work out the best ways to figure it out. And like I said, that's what we're here to do today, with highlighting how Oregon State is focusing on video, but also how we can better assist you and all of the libraries here to find the best solutions. I will flag that the ROI metrics that we have been reviewing since launching Kanopy, both the PDA program and other options we have, are staying true. Our cost per use on average across all libraries we work with has actually gone back to the same place it was in 2015 at $3.08 per play. 65% of plays are still at absolutely no cost to the library, and we're still seeing an average of 28 plays for all triggered films. So in terms of the return on investment that the libraries are getting for the academic usage, it is still staying true to that same value. But we do understand budgets are shifting. With use-driven programs, the more use you have, the higher cost you have, and this is a resource that 5 years ago, 10 years ago, didn't really exist, and it didn't have a large area of budget for libraries. So how do we all work together to find the best solutions forward? We have recently launched a capped program, which gives predictability and certainty with your spend for a 12-month period. We're also working with hybrid options, supplier collections, ways that you can offer the largest amount of video or the videos that are of the strategic goals your library has at the cost that makes sense for you. I will hand over to Kerri now so she can share a bit more about her institution and what they're doing with video, but I'd love to connect with all of you after, just in terms of the best options for you.
So just to make sure you're all awake, can I get a show of hands? Who is not from the United States here? Okay, thank you. I just want to make sure if I start talking about something that's very specific to Oregon or the states that I recognize I have a more diverse audience than that. So I'm going to go ahead and get started, mostly to give you a bit of a background, a lens for how we do streaming video, and then more specifically, Ryan will go into some of our data to share. Oregon State University, obviously in Oregon, on the West Coast. We are a land, sea, sun, and space grant institution, heavily STEM-focused curriculum, which some of you who are not STEM-focused might wonder why Kanopy, why streaming video, and Ryan will share a little bit more about that later. We have, as a land grant, a mission to support learning across the state of Oregon. And we have a long history of doing that at Oregon State. In 1925, KOAC was our radio, and that was our means, media, of getting education across the state. That station later became Oregon Public Broadcasting, or OPB, if you're familiar with that at all. In 1957, KOAC TV began broadcasts of educational lectures, again, to support that land grant mission. And then later on in the 80s, we began our distance education program. We call it ECampus. We have about 24,000 students in ECampus across 50 states and in 50 countries. In 2019, we were ranked third by U.S. News Best Online Programs for bachelor's degrees. ECampus is separate from the library. They're their own institution, they're self-sufficient, so the money they get from tuition goes directly back into the work that they do. For our libraries, Oregon State University Libraries and Press, we have a collection model of access over ownership. And that could be a little bit different from the institutions where you're at, where buying something, owning that in perpetuity is more important than the immediate access. We're not building a research collection for the ages, and that was decided probably well over a decade ago. But when appropriate for our space, our curriculum, and or our budget, we do seek to own when it's possible. Sorry, I thought there was something else I was going to mention about the library model. In any case, it gives you a little bit of a background about why streaming media works for Oregon State. I want to talk a little bit about ECampus Support in terms of budget. As I mentioned, they're separate from the library, but most of the support, I would say right now, we're probably looking at maybe 60 to 70% of the funding that goes towards Kanopy specifically comes from that partnership that we have with them. In 2014, they were leasing titles directly from Kanopy, unbeknownst to the library. I'm sure that's never happened at any of your institutions where someone's gone direct to lease or purchase something. We found out when we decided to do a trial with Kanopy, and they said, oh no, OSU already has an account. No, we don't. In any case, we decided to work with eCampus to establish a better access model for the institution that aligned with our land grant mission. I think as most people who've experienced any new program, especially with streaming videos regardless of platform, we were a bit surprised in usage and we had not budgeted accordingly. And we had to add in money mid-year to our deposit account for the first couple years. Because of my experience with short-term loans and ebooks, I had already been adding in a kind of a contingency line in my budget to help for those kind of emergency situations. So we were able to keep Kanopy fully available, which I think is a good thing for us because now we have better usage. We didn't cut off mid-year. As Shannon mentioned, we are participating in the capped PDA pilot, and this is coming at a really good time because this year when we asked ECampus for funding, we needed to ask for more money because usage had gone up, and they were not really excited by the price increase, and were questioning whether ECampus was really using that amount of Kanopy streaming video. So we're hoping that through more dialogue, more data, that we will be able to demonstrate to our partners that indeed ECampus is using this and that they should continue to help support us. In case they don't, though, hopefully the capped PDA will support our budgeting needs. Other challenges we have with ECampus wanting to know specifically who's using the streaming content through Kanopy is our authentication. We currently use Easy Proxy. We're not capturing that data down to are you an ECampus student or not. So we're going to have to look at that a little bit more because ECampus also provides us some funding for some other resources. The other thing is ECampus is too good. We have on-campus students who are taking classes through ECampus at the same time. So as a library, how do I divide up a student who's taking 10 credits on campus and 3 credits through ECampus to know what percentage goes where? So that's an interesting challenge for us. And I will say again, just to give you a lens of streaming video at Oregon State, we're only using about 3% of our budget for this medium. Again, being a STEM school, a lot of our budget goes to some big publishers for journal content. Just quickly for accessibility and usage. So I mentioned ECampus was leasing titles in 2014, and shame on them, they were doing that at a time when Kanopy didn't have transcripts. So when we were doing our trial, we got great feedback regarding Kanopy, the content, but we did not move forward with that platform until transcripts were available. And I think most everybody now, that's probably the first or second question you ask any streaming media is, what's your accessibility standards? Do you have transcripts or closed captioning? And now Kanopy is doing a very good job of that, and we're very happy to be able to provide that. Another accessibility lens is faculty have told us how much they appreciate having streaming media now instead of a DVD in course reserves, mostly because they can assign students to watch that outside of class and use class time for what? Actual discussion. There's actually learning happening in class, not students sleeping through a 2-hour video. I've not talked to students yet. I'm pretty sure they're not super happy about it, but I do know directly from faculty they are happy. Going back to our distance learners, I mentioned course reserves. A distance learner is not on campus, does not have access to the DVD that's placed on course reserves. They're also not in a physical classroom where they could possibly have a viewing party. They need to have access individually, and streaming media allows them to do that, and that's really important for our 24,000 plus students. We do understand, especially for some of our international students, there are issues in terms of network and technology, but our eCampus does a pretty good job of walking people through that. There probably could be like a whole workshop on different learning modality needs. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here except to say we know there's been research. Not every student or faculty identifies with our disability access services that they have a learning modality need. And personally, it feels better to me to not assume that I know how every person needs to learn. And streaming media, especially when we have transcripts provided and other accessibility measures, helps me feel a little bit better that people are getting content delivered to them in a manner that they can learn from. And my final comment about access or accessibility is, even though we are a STEM curriculum school, we do have the important humanities and social sciences being taught, and we've had direct requests for international films for people to study, especially like in the German language, foreign language, learning language. We have an international program, so helping people learn English through transcripts, etc. In social sciences, counseling, and we've also had an increase in diversity, equity, and inclusion requests from different departments on campus as well. So we're not only supporting students and faculty, we're also supporting our own development. In the stats we see from Kanopy, and I'm not going to steal too much of Ryan's thunder, we do see a high use in African studies, agricultural and geology, anthropology, and applied sciences. We do also have other streaming video platforms that help us support in the other areas, and that's probably why we're not seeing such things as counseling on the Kanopy platform. So I'm going to go ahead and let Ryan take over and wow you with some of the data.
Thank you, Kerri. Hello. How's everyone doing? Hi, Nicole. Hi. I'm Ryan, and I work at Kanopy. As Kerri said, I'm a data analyst, so that means that I focus my time on our content and our users and how they interact with the platform in particular. Now, as you might imagine, academic libraries are the heart and soul of Kanopy. It's where we find our most active and passionate users in particular. Students and faculty around the world watched more than 20 million minutes on Kanopy last month, spread across, I think, something on the order of 20,000 videos across all of our territories. Now, that's a top-down stat about Kanopy that I think a lot of librarians don't really get, and that's a vantage point that I have that you don't have. And so I think it's probably important that you guys start to understand Kanopy on a larger level too, because in general, you only get to see the world of your own school. So going forward, I hope that we are able to have more discussions about this, because I think it's going to be really instructive for you guys to see how Kanopy operates on a larger level, and that can help us inform you about the way that you manage your school. Anyway, perhaps the biggest question, though, that we get from librarians is, what are students really watching? And I think it's a valid question. When we hear that, we know that librarians want to ensure that students are using Kanopy the right way, which is to say, a way that advances their education. Now, this is first from the highest possible perch, sitting on top of Kanopy's academic customers. What are students and faculty watching the most? And how much of the titles are actually being watched? Now, there are a lot of different ways for me to answer this question, and some of them have positives and some of them have negatives, but I'm going to walk you through the way that I see the problem on a couple different levels. One way we can answer this question is looking at the metadata in particular. Now, what I like to do is I like to sample, because that allows me to see both widely and with depth in a way that I can manage. And so what I like to do often is look at the top quartile of minutes generated by academic Kanopy users and see what's happening within that group. That often tells me a lot about what is really being focused on within the platform. This is a word cloud of the metadata generated by the top 25% of all minutes watched by Kanopy users last month. This isn't really evaluative data. I can't draw a value judgment from it, but it's descriptive, and I think it's really interesting. And there are a few different conclusions that we can draw. One thing we can draw is that I would say topics around what we call cultural studies represent the most watched categories on Kanopy. That is a bit of an Ouroboros situation because a lot of content is produced within those lanes, and so therefore it is able to be assigned or able to be watched on the platform. We see kind of an underrepresentation of content in topics like engineering and some of the deeper sciences, even though those are very popular subjects across universities around the world. There isn't quite as much video content about them yet, and so there's a little bit of gap in terms of usage there. But regardless. So this is, sorry about that. I have two different computers here. So this is what the metadata looks like on the top 25% of minutes generated by all EDUs. Now this is what it looks like at Oregon State. Now it's hard to compare the different word clouds, but I've tried to do the emphasis for you. And something that I would like to really point out is that the emphasis of agriculture, environmental science, geology, health, and science in particular have much greater emphasis in this word cloud than before. In fact, when I measure it out, it's about 60% more mentions of tags related to science than we find overall. This is consistent with what we know about Oregon State. As Kerri mentioned, there are ECampus users, and when we look into Oregon State's data, we see that the distribution of their majors leans very heavily toward the sciences in particular. Agricultural sciences represents about 16% of the distance learners at Oregon State, and science in particular is another 12. It all adds up to something on the order of 43%. Now, given that we know this, and given that we see the results in the data that science is overrepresented within the word cloud, that tells me that we are on the right track, that what students are actually watching is being categorized correctly. Now, at Kanopy, though, we don't see our content exactly the same way that schools do, mainly because we are not them. We don't have curriculum to assign, and we're not really left with needs, so we have to infer what many videos are for and which disciplines use them at which school. So we have a group of 12 solid subject tags that we use to understand our academic assignments. It's not an exhaustive list, and it's not really tailored as neatly as the intent of the content would dictate, but it does give us an overview. And when I look at Oregon's usage taken through this lens, and it should be noted this lens is spread across 12 different subjects, and it's seen in terms of plays per 100 users per month. That way I can hold the number of users consistent, and I can really see the difference in their choices from month to month. What I see is this breakdown. And again, it's a bunch of bars, but I will tell you that the main takeaway is that at Oregon State, there are about 6 different categories that nudge above 25 plays per 100 users per month, and that is when a subject really starts to matter. Oregon State has 6 different subjects that start to kind of peak above the surface like that, and I believe for schools of their typical size, the average is something on the order of 4 or 5, so they track a little bit ahead in terms of usage. Okay. Now, metadata, as I've been talking about, is certainly important, but it's not always our best route to evaluating how many needles are in the haystack. There's another way that I kind of like, and it's a little bit more crude, but it gives me some more specificity, and that is to evaluate content by supplier. This is almost kind of like a birthing theory. If we assume that a supplier produces similar quality titles over time and that they have goals to produce consistent content, then I think we can start to understand their content as a function of what they're doing. The top quartile of minutes generated by academic users generated something on the order of 250 metadata tags, but those same number of minutes only come from about 26 different suppliers. So knowing that, over the summer I evaluated more than 850 different suppliers that have content on Kanopy. What I was trying to do, what I was trying to do was understand to what degree do these suppliers create content that is either assigned or as part of curriculum. If we could determine with a high degree of confidence that suppliers create curriculum content, then I would label that tier 3. If we found that the supplier had more mixed results, then that was a tier 2. And if we found that there was a very low probability that the supplier created content that was ever assigned or used in curriculum, then that was a tier 1. Now, I think we all know the deeper problem with this type of categorization, and which is that the plate is not the meal. There are films from suppliers in Group 1 that are undoubtedly substantive and educational and are worthy of a higher grade. But because I can't really make a title-by-title judgment on every single video, I generalize. And I deliberately try to generalize in a manner that does not dilute the definition of educational content. I want this to be a meaningful measure. So I needed strong evidence that a supplier produced educated content. The standard was, does the distribution of interest in public libraries or academic libraries lean toward education? Is there evidence in the revenue split that title is more of a public phenomenon than an academic one? And we also look at the history of the supplier. Does the supplier create titles that are widely watched and clearly assigned in the past? If the answer to those questions were all yes, then you would get a tier 3 designation. If there are 1 or 2 no's in there, then that would make you a 2. And if you were something closer to a theatrical distributor, then that means that you're tier 1. However, it should be noted that a distributor like HBO Documentary Films would be categorized as a tier 1 in this situation, but very often the content that they produce has benefits that are beyond just entertainment. So what happens when we apply these standards to Oregon State? When we look at Oregon State's top 100 videos watched, we see that 49% are actually tier 3. That compares to 40%, which is the average across all schools on Kanopy. We also see that when you combine tiers 2 and 3, that results in, I think it's 82% of all their content coming from suppliers that we believe are high probability of creating assignments or ones that have split results. Again, Oregon State leads the pack when it comes to having their students engage with educational content. Now, overall, Oregon State is among our best customers and the most engaged customers. Over the last 2 years, they are 16th in the estimated total number of watchers. They're 18th in plays, and they are 19th in the unique number of titles engaged. Now, what's interesting to me, though, is they're actually 94th in plays per watcher at 2.91. And that's because even though there's a strong alignment between the number of users they have and the number of activity they're generating on the platform, what they don't have is a small group of users that are going wild on the content, which is something that you see typically at smaller schools. So as a result, even though they have high numbers in terms of bulk, it's very interesting that they're just only barely inside the top quartile in terms of plays per watcher. That means that they have very even usage across all of their users, which I think aligns with positive use of Kanopy. Now, when we take Oregon State's activity in terms of the videos that they watch, reapply them to the category, the 12 different categories that we see content flow through, and then compare that to average, we can really start to understand the difference between the way Oregon State users operate and the rest of the country operates on Kanopy. Here, it's a series of dots, but what you should note is where the gaps are largest, and that's under health and under science. Oregon State has relatively normal use across about 9 of the 12 categories, but in those 2 or 3 in particular, they are way out in front. And again, that's very consistent with what we saw about their distance learners before. These are science categories in particular. So we really see that Oregon kind of separates itself by having this type of emphasis in their education. Now, using just a global average is nice, but the reality is that we always kind of want a higher level of acuity when we come to picking comps. And I know a lot of universities do this, Oregon is one of them, and we were really delighted that they were able to share this information with us. These are the 3 different groups of similar schools that Oregon has identified for themselves as schools that they see as similar now, similar in the near future, and aspirationally similar at a larger stage than that. These are the orange peers, the next tier peers, and the land-grant university peers. Now, when we compared Oregon to the larger Kanopy average, we saw that they were actually pretty close in many categories. Thehowever, when we apply the same analysis to their closer peer group, what's interesting to me is that there's actually a larger spread. When it comes to the land-grant institutions in particular, we can see that the business watching, the media and communications watching, and even the film studies watching is far ahead of anything that Oregon does, or even the other peer groups do. That suggests to me that these large schools either have notable film studies programs, or they have notable graduate business programs that are assigning content. Now, all of this is talking about engagement with content in kind of a 2-dimensional way. It's minutes watched or it's plays, because those are things that we can track. But very often what I care about is something that's deeper, and it's measuring the quality of viewing. And that's not an easy thing to do. Now, my background before I worked at Kanopy was actually in professional sports. I don't know if we have any baseball wonks here, but I used to work in the sports agency world, and I worked with advanced analytics. And in the world of pro sports, there's been a real data revolution over the last 20 years. And there's a framework that has come into vogue that helps modern front offices evaluate what they're doing. That framework is called WAR. It means wins above replacement. So because I'm a sports guy, I decided that I really liked the framework, but I wanted to apply it to the questions that we try to answer. So in baseball, they call it WAR, but at Kanopy, we call it K. This is my value metric, and it's based on 4 pillars. The pillars are interest, action, context, and satisfaction. Across, I think it's more than 50 different measures, I try to model what interest looks like, what action during the video looks like, what the context around the video is at that time, and then the user satisfaction either when they're done or it seems like they have been completed. When I weight these values together, I get an interesting view of what I think users on Kanopy really like. When we look at most played titles, you can see literally who starts a video file, but it doesn't really tell you a lot about whether they finished or whether they seem to actually enjoy it, whether they rewatched parts of it, or whether they shared it with someone, or whether they gave it a good rating. All of those things, I think, are very telling details about what it means to engage with video content, and it's important that we track them. So, when I use K and I apply it to titles, I get something like this. Across all of EDU users, these are the top 20 titles as measured by K. And within the, I'm not sure if you can see here, but within the columns we have one column says plays rank that tells you where this would rank, where this title ranks in terms of its just pure engagement. And then we have the K value metric, which drives the ranking here. And we can see a few interesting things. For me, for number 1, it's title number 14, Race the Power of Illusion. That is the #1 most played title the world over on Kanopy, and I should tell you, it's the most played title by far. It is the title that we can tell is assigned the most and where we have the most viewing user clusters coalesce around it at different schools. And it's widely seen, but actually it's only 14th in terms of K, because it looks like, on average, users only complete about 14% of the video, which is very, very low. I should give you a bit of a context. I'm going to tell you something that's true for both academic users and public users. The rule for minutes flow is 50 at 50. About half of your users drop off at the halfway mark. I see that with users watching just straight entertainment movies on the public side, and I also see it on academics. It's so consistent that I have a hard time doubting it, but that's a little bit of context to understand what these completion numbers really mean. So that's something like Race the Power and Illusion, which loses status, But then there's something like Place Matters by California Newsreel, which is third and is actually only the 27th most watched title, and yet on average it looks like users finish 57% of it, which is a very, very high number. We also see a bunch of other California Newsreel titles here, in particular Bad Sugar, which I think has the highest completion percentage of anything in this group at 61%. As we all know, health and food topics do really well on video, and we see that on Kanopy as well. So this is what K looks like across the entire spectrum. But again, what does it look like when we just apply it to Oregon State? The truth is that there is a large difference. The titles here that are grayed out are actually the ones that are shared with the overall top 20. That means that, and I think only 5 here are grayed out, which means that what makes up Oregon State's top 20 films by K is actually 75% different than what we saw before. And we can see, again, titles like Tomorrow and The Real Dirt on Farmer John and A River Between Us from Green Planet Films are all related to topics like agriculture and science. So again, this validates what we see from their user base, and it validates what we see from the totals overall. This gives us, I think, a really good understanding of what Oregon State users really like and how we can use information about what they're watching to give them more things that they're going to find useful for their education going forward. Anyway, this is just a sample of the type of analysis that I'm trying to do with our content as we go forward, and I really look forward to having conversations with any of you and being able to collect some more data from libraries so we can provide more kind of interesting deep dives on individual schools, because I find this particularly fascinating, and I think that Kanopy users are singular among all streaming services. Anyway, I think that that's all for me now, so thank you very much, and I think, do we want to go to, do we have time for?